This is Counting Macros. Today is July 29th. And I think after today's FOMC decision, I can finally say, welcome to the Kevin Warsh Show. The reason I say the Kevin Warsh Show is because watching the presser, it really did feel like a performance. Some of his responses I thought were very cogent and were answered very well. Others I thought a little odd, but I guess I can start by talking about a bit of the slightly more performative aspects of his press conference, particularly in his answers to the media's questions. And by that I mean he was calling people by their names in the middle of his answers. He began some of these answers with slightly patronizing comments. I remember one specifically, he said, that question makes it seem like, you were right there in the room with us while we were debating. And I mean, that's fine, I guess, but he painted in large brush strokes and kept reiterating how he's become more confident in the FOMC's ability to reach their goals and how their discussions have been incredibly robust and that they're doing great work and that he's heartened by the reception he's got over the last 8.5 weeks to 9 weeks. But there wasn't a whole lot of specifics that he provided. And what that tells me, at least now, is that we know what we're going to get from Kevin Warsh. In his first presser, maybe you give him a bit of slack. It's his first press conference, and it was a relatively mundane decision to hold rates. But now, in July, there was potential for a hike, and we sort of got left with nothing. In terms of what I think Warsh did well was his answers to questions about the end of forward guidance. He included in his initial statements that while the policy decision remained consistent with the last FOMC meeting to maintain rates between 3.5 to 3.75%, there was nothing inertial about their discussions. He noted that there's been a change since their last meeting and that nominal and real yields are materially higher across the curve. And he gave this quote. He said, market participants are learning to play the ball, not the referee. And I think that kind of characterizes what Warsh wants to do at the Fed. He wants to take them out of the spotlight and try to make them almost as insignificant as possible in the financial markets. Someone asked him, in the absence of forward guidance, what message are you getting from the markets? And Warsh answered in saying that the message from the markets is the message from the markets, and it's the Fed's job to try not to interfere with those signals. And he was asked, why should rates not be higher given current conditions? Warsh saying the markets have done that, and that rates are higher right now. If you look at sort of treasury market transaction across the yield curve, markets are reacting in real time and giving them that feedback. Finally, he was asked, what are the risks associated with potentially surprising the markets relative to what's being priced in? His response was that surprise isn't the goal. Making the best decision is. And by not previewing decisions, the Fed is getting signals from the financial markets instead of the financial market just repeating the policy outlook that the Fed's publicized. Another interesting point I think he made on the topic of forward guidance was an example from the Great Financial Crisis, where the Fed was very transparent in their actions and their forecasting and what that would look like. And he says that forward guidance makes sense in a crisis, but in benign conditions, it should be reevaluated. Given in crisis, people need reassurance and an understanding of how the country is going to get out of crisis. But in the benign conditions that we're in right now, it's best to let the market react to data as it comes out and then work from there and use that as another information source instead of the financial market just being a mirror of what the Fed has already said. But we've gotten to a point where so many years of forward guidance have led market participants to expect so much transparency from the Fed and sort of try and eat everything up and then digest it and incorporate it into their movements and their actions. But I think Warsh provides some good justification for his end to forward guidance. Some things that I think weren't so great about Warsh's press conference was I found it to be very theatrical, but I think that's sort of the change that we now have to experience. I remember a lot of people enjoyed Big J Powell as the chair, given how blunt he was. He didn't sugarcoat much. He sort of just gave it to you straight. And now with Warsh, it seems like although he's trying to have the Fed take a step back, as chairman, he does have this sort of persona to him, this personality that almost feels like he's a politician. There were 3 dissenters to the decision that all voted in favor of a rate hike. Someone asked, what were the arguments from the dissenters? And Warsh started answering something tangentially related to the question, but never really gave a straight answer. Once again, he was asked what the argument for a pause was. And Warsh said, I wouldn't necessarily characterize this as a pause. The markets didn't pause. Market prices reacted to data as it came out, which feels like a little bit of a defensive response. Clearly, by the phrase pause, they mean holding rates steady. What was the thinking and the rationale behind this policy decision? And Warsh gave absolutely zero insight. And finally, Michael McKee from Bloomberg TV sort of directly asked Warsh, what are you waiting for? Because we've had very solid labor data. Inflation's been high for a very long time. He's like, what are you waiting for? What are you looking for? And Warsh sort of sidestepped this question and answered again in a snarky way. He said, the press conference is not all that I've done today, right? He talks a lot about the work that they're putting in at the FOMC and the Fed and all these task forces, but he never really describes what it is. And Safir from Reuters asked, what do you mean by you have no tolerance for inflation if you didn't take any action? He said that the reaction seemed to him to be a little impatient, but the current regime has been working together for less than 9 weeks. The thing that I found interesting about this was a lot of the people that are currently on the FOMC have been there for a long time. I mean, of course, Jay Powell's still there, Lisa Cook, Waller, Barr, Bowman. A lot of these guys have been there for a long time. So it's like a Theseus ship kind of question. Like, just because you got a few different players, does it mean it's like a completely new regime? Like, surely some of the knowledge and the methodologies would carry over from chairmanship to chairmanship. But it seems like the big theme really that Warsh wanted to put forward in his testimony and his answers was that he wants time. He said that they would have better judgment in the coming months of the underlying inflation dynamics. And interestingly, to a question being asked about what measure is sort of being relied on for the 2% inflation target, he added the comment, without fully revealing my cards, before answering that question. And that, I think, is going to really define who Kevin Warsh is and what we can expect from him, which is not much in these press conferences. And I think the reaction from the market to this was quite interesting. I got a bit of this from J.D. Durkin, so credit to him. The S&P was trading down until the presser was briefly positive, and then at 3 p.m. again it went negative. And J.D. suggests that perhaps this is due to sentiment that the Fed is now behind the curve, and the S&P ended the day down 1.5%. And this feels kind of confusing to me, because the market's priced in a hold, and prediction markets like Kalshi had the possibility of a hike at only roughly 25%. So suddenly the sentiment seems to be flipped to the Fed being behind the curve, when it seemed like most people expected exactly what happened. Even the reporters and the presser seemed confused as to why there wasn't a hike, as I outlined in the questions that I mentioned before. I'm curious sort of why there is such a negative reaction to the Fed holding rates. Warsh mentioned a robust and resilient economy, and rates being held steady really shouldn't hamper business investment. And the conclusion that I got from all of this is that everyone is just confused and they don't know what to expect. And I think what Warsh is doing is shifting what people should expect from the Fed and trying to reduce the Fed's implications in financial markets. And this is going to come with an adjustment period. But Kevin Warsh has cemented himself as a tight-lipped guy, and I think it's going to stay that way for a while. But the performance, I don't think, will ever end. He'll sort of answer questions with large brushstrokes and crediting the work that gets done at the Federal Reserve without really giving us any insight into what's going on there. And I think that is going to be hard to get used to for a lot of people, but I think is going to become the new norm as we move forward. If you want to see a summary on the rate decision and the statement that Kevin Warsh gave, that's on the Open Market Operation website. I'll link that in the description. That's all for this segment. Be on the lookout for more.